I'm pastoring the same church after 26 years. You know why? Because my dad said I wasn't allowed to quit. And I haven't quit. And so I have taken that message of my dad's life. That was the first thing. The second thing, the second value of my father's was honesty. I mean, this guy thought that the only thing that was really worth and had value in life was telling the truth. And he did not do criminal work as a lawyer. And he used to tell me this: I don't do criminal work because at least that way I have a 50% chance of my client actually telling me the truth.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
This morning, I want to talk about disappointments with others, because we will all have disappointments with other people. How are we going to deal with those? And this morning, I'm entitling my message, Only When I Laugh. Now, let me explain that. In 1968, there was a movie came out starring Richard Attenborough. It was called Only When I Larf, had sort of it was a British comedy. And here's what happened 3 times in the movie. I find it kind of entertaining. I've been asking people if anybody's seen this movie. Almost nobody's seen it. It doesn't matter. I'm explaining it to you. 3 times in the movie, there was someone mortally wounded, and someone asked them this question: does it hurt? One guy had a spear in him. Does it hurt? And the answer was, only when I larf. Only when I larf. And of course, it's irony. It's sarcasm. Of course, it hurts. And of course, that expression, it only hurts when I laugh, has become a little bit of an idiom that we use in our society. There's a song by that name. There's a TV show by that name. That expression is used on a whole bunch of different levels. Of course, it hurts. We're kidding. So what I'm trying to say here this morning is this, is that when we get disappointed, of course it hurts. That's not even a question. We're not laughing about the disappointments in life. But what we need to do is we need to learn how to deal with those disappointments with others, because they're going to come. They're going to come in the past, or they've come in the past, and they're going to come in the future. And we need to know how to position ourselves, because if we allow the pain of disappointment, that's when we become defeated. And we need to have a good attitude in the midst of whatever disappointments, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We have to develop a great attitude, and we've got to begin to look at the disappointments in our life with a bit of a different viewpoint, and that's what we're going to discover this morning. How do we deal with the disappointments with others? Now, if you have found Psalm 55, we're going to read the words of King David, so that's who's speaking here, and he tells a story of one of his great disappointments. And so listen to this story, starting at verse 12. It says, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor it is one who hates me, who has magnified himself against me, then I could hide from him. But it was you, a man, my equal, my companion and my acquaintance, who we took sweet counsel together and walked in the house of God in the throng." Look at the next verse. "Let death seize them. Let them go down alive to hell, and wickedness in their dwellings and among them." And they get bitter much, David? He's going on about his disappointment, and then he wishes that they would go down to hell alive. I'm thinking, you know what, David? You should have reread that before you posted it. That's what I'm thinking. You've all done that, right? You should have reread it before you hit send or submit. But anyway, that's what David did. He just was out there. You know that this guy is hurting, right? I mean, he is in a very disappointed, hurt state. But you don't know, or you're going to find out now, why he was so hurt. We know what this story is about. We know who this person is that he's talking about. And the man's name was Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel was a contemporary of David's. He was actually his advisor. He was actually his mentor, probably. He was about 10 or 11 years older than David. He was one of his key advisors. He was the one that David would have prayed with. He was the one that he would have gone to and asked for help and counsel. Nobody succeeds alone. He was the man that had mentored David. He was the man that David looked up to. And this was the man that they walked together, the scripture says. "I walked together with you." Yet this man, Ahithophel, betrayed him. Now, let me tell you the story, and some of you will remember at least part of this. David had a son named Absalom. Absalom rebelled against David, didn't he? He rebelled. He formed an army. He actually went to battle against his own father with the whole goal of wresting the kingdom of Israel away from his own father and becoming king in his place. Here's what David is talking about in this psalm. His chief advisor, Ahithophel, actually joined Absalom in the rebellion. That's why he is so hurt by this. That's why he is so bitter about this. Not only that, many commentators believe that Ahithophel actually might have been the one who incited Absalom to rebel against David. So now we begin to understand why David was so upset and why he writes these words and why he allows these things to come out of his mouth. Let death seize them. Let them go down to hell alive. You can see that this man is so significantly hurt. But we don't know the whole story. And my first point this morning in dealing with the disappointments with others is this. We need to seek to understand. You see, when we get disappointed with another person, when they let us down, when they deny us or betray us or do something that in some way hurts us, a lot of times all we can see is our point of view. All we can see is our own hurt. We go to say how that makes me feel or how that makes me look or how that affects me. And more often than not, we forget to look at the other person's point of view. We have to seek to understand where they are coming from and why they did what they did. So I'm going to, like Paul Harvey, now for the rest of the story. Because let's look at the story of Ahithophel and Absalom and show you the other side that David wasn't telling us about in Psalm 55. First of all, this is how it goes. David had a bunch of wives. You probably know that. As a result, he had a bunch of kids from a bunch of wives, and these kids were all related in various levels. Some were full brother and sister, some were half brother and sister. That's how it played out. Absalom had a half brother named Ammon. Ammon raped Absalom's full sister, Tamar. He raped his half sister. And when Absalom went to David about it, David did nothing about it. As the father, as the king, and the patriarch of that family, he did nothing about it. That produced a bitterness in Absalom's heart. And that brood and that root of bitterness took hold of Absalom, and that's why 2 years later he rebelled. You need to understand what's going on in Absalom's head. He's thinking, my dad's lost it. My dad is no longer fit to rule the kingdom. He doesn't listen to people. He doesn't take advice from anybody. He's making mistakes. He's making bad judgment. And he, in his mind, thought he was doing the right thing. He thought, I need to replace my father because my father has gone off the rails. Now, that doesn't explain the Ahithophel, but here it goes. And let me tell you something, folks. This is a bombshell. Listen carefully. Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. If you know your genealogy of the scripture, his granddaughter, his young granddaughter, was Bathsheba. Don't think for a moment, when David looked out that window on that fateful day and saw that woman bathing on her roof, don't think for a minute that David didn't know who that was. David knew exactly who that was, or at least he knew her when she was young. I want you to understand this. David was 50 years old. She was a 20-year-old newly married girl. David took her, he violated her, he got her pregnant, and then he conspired to have Uriah, her young husband that was fighting the fight for him, conspired to have him killed. And Ahithophel, the grandfather, watched this whole thing play out as his best friend, David, pulled a Hugh Hefner on his granddaughter. Don't miss what's going on here, people. This was a despicable act. Bathsheba, think about this. If his best friend was Ahithophel, then David knew the son of Ahithophel, and of course he knew the granddaughter. And that same little girl was probably bouncing on David's knee at some point years earlier, but now she's grown up into this beautiful young woman, and he sees her, and lust seized his heart, and he calls her in and violates this woman. Now put yourself in Ahithophel's shoes for a moment. How would you feel if your middle-aged friend went and violated your 20-year-old granddaughter? And you couldn't do a thing about it. Why couldn't you do anything about it? Because you were not the king David was. And David could do what he wanted to do. And you watched as that whole thing played out. And so then when Absalom was stirring up this rebellion, you looked at that and you went, I'm going to be part of that. Because David has definitely gone off the rails. David is no longer fit to serve. David doesn't see this. He's going on about how he's hurt and how he's betrayed by his best friend, and he forgets to tell us the rest of the story. You want to hear the really bad ending to this story? Because it even gets worse. After Ahithophel went and led the rebellion with Absalom, he was so filled with remorse that he went out and hung himself and took his own life. If this sounds vaguely familiar to the story of Jesus and Judas, there's a reason. It is the Old Testament type and shadow. You see, Jesus was the son of David, and Ahithophel was the type and shadow of Judas that was to come. Everything's foreshadowed. Everything points forward in the Scripture. It's a sad and terrible ending. You see, when we look at our own lives, many times we too have disappointments. And unfortunately, we can only see our own side. And what we need to do is we need to stand back and we need to begin to see the big picture, and we need to see what's going on in the other person's life. We need to seek to understand. I'm going to tell you a very personal and poignant story this morning about my own family. My father, as I mentioned earlier, my father was a lawyer, and my father had two virtues that were just basically his foundation in which he lived. And one was commitment, and the other one was honesty. You know when the Scripture says he will ascend to the hill of the Lord, but he who swears to his own hurt? That was my dad. My dad, if he committed to something, he did it, and he took that truth, and he imparted it to his children. If we started something, he would never let us quit. If we started a sport, he wouldn't let us quit until that sport was done. If we started a job, he wouldn't let us quit that job. And I look at my own life, because that value of commitment was so drilled into me and ingrained into me. I know that at least in part, I live in the same neighborhood I grew up with, at least in part because of that. I'm married to the same woman for 31 years, at least in part due to the message of my father. I'm pastoring the same church after 26 years. You know why? Because my dad said I wasn't allowed to quit. And I haven't quit. And so I have taken that message of my dad's life. That was the first thing. The second thing, the second value of my father's was honesty. I mean, this guy thought that the only thing that was really worth and had value in life was telling the truth. And he did not do criminal work as a lawyer. And he used to tell me this: I don't do criminal work because at least that way I have a 50% chance of my client actually telling me the truth. He figured as long as he was dealing with the criminal element, they were probably lying to him, and he was probably right. And so honesty was sort of another key pillar in his life. And I mean, it's sort of ironic, because the one thing we joke about with lawyers is them being dishonest, right? I mean, all the lawyer jokes are all about, you know, what snake in the grass these lawyers are. Lawyers really get a bum rap. But that is not going to stop me from telling a lawyer joke this morning. Because I got to tell you my dad's favorite lawyer joke. This was his joke. He loved to tell it. And he used to say this, that they were starting to use lawyers instead of rats in lab experiments. And there was 3 reasons why they were doing that. Number 1, there are more lawyers than there are rats. Number 2, you don't get as attached to lawyers as you do to rats. And number 3, there's some things rats just won't do. When I look at the lawyers I know and I've met throughout my life, honestly, they've been some of the most honest, upright people I've ever met, because they're people of the law. They're people of right and wrong, and they have something to uphold. And that's who my father was: committed, honest as the day was long. So imagine our complete and utter shock and surprise when one day, when he announced he was going hunting, which he did every fall, and he packed up his gear and he walked out of the house, he never returned. And he went out and he moved in with another woman, and everything changed. And my dad, this man of honesty, integrity, and commitment, all of a sudden just abandoned his family, just walked away from his wife, walked away from his children, and everybody was shocked. And I'll be honest with you, I was mad at him. And every opportunity I had, I laid into him. And I remember one day I was talking to him, I was laying into him, and I was giving him a piece of my mind, which is free, by the way. And I was giving him a piece of my mind, and he said, "Hang on a minute, Mark, before you judge me. How come nobody ever asked me this question, are you happy?" And I'm thinking to myself, maybe because we don't care, maybe, you know. But I said, okay. I stopped, and I said, okay, are you happy? And he said, yeah, I'm happy. And I thought, still don't care, because you know what? I don't believe in happiness. You know that. I've told you that many times. What do you mean you don't believe in happiness? Well, it's not that I don't believe in it. I just don't believe it's the highest pursuit of life. I think there are so many higher aspirations of honesty and integrity and commitment and righteousness and valor and heroism, and the list goes on and on. You know, for me, happiness is somewhere down here. And there are so many higher aspirations for us. But nevertheless, he said, I'm happy. So I walked away from that encounter with him, and I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I have never tried to understand his viewpoint in this. And so I began to think about it. It took me a few days, but I began to think about it. And I thought, you know what? He wasn't happy. And even though, maybe I don't value that as much as some people do, I need to at least try to understand that. It doesn't make it right, but I need to understand it. Here he was. He reached middle age. He hit his midlife crisis. He looked at his life. He looked at his family. He had 6 bratty kids, of which I was one of them. And he thought, is this all there is to life? I'm not enjoying this. I'm just working hard. I'm paying the bills. I'm getting nothing out of this. And so what he did was he changed his life. He walked away from it, and he made a new life with a new family and new friends, new interests and new hobbies, and he completely wholesale renovation of his life. But he wasn't actually totally honest with us as to whether he was happy. He thought he was going to be happy, but he actually wasn't. You know why? Because he was the same person that moved from this world and life into this life. He didn't change. And so actually, the happiness that he was pursuing was a bit elusive. But I'll tell you what, it helped me because I understood, okay, he did this because he was unhappy. And that doesn't make it right. Don't let anybody think that I am in any way validating this, because I'm not. But what I have to do is I have to seek to understand the person who's disappointed me. And once I was able to understand how unhappy he was with his life, then my anger turned to compassion. And I began to see him a different way. And our relationship got restored. And for the next 15 years of his life, and he's passed away now, but for the next 15 years of his life, we had a great and a fantastic relationship. So what we need to do, I don't want you to miss this point, when we're dealing with disappointments with others, we need to seek to understand what's going on in the other person and not just look at it from our own selfish, myopic viewpoint of life. You have to step back from the situation, and you have to see the big picture, because more often than not, there's more going on than meets the eye, right? All right, so how do you deal with disappointment in life and disappointment with others? The first thing is you have to seek to understand where the other person is coming from. The second thing is you need to seek to forgive. Jesus said this, if you will not forgive your brother, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you. Wow, did you hear that? Those are pretty high stakes, don't you think? I got news for you. Those stakes are too high. If I'm not willing to forgive you, God will not forgive me. That's somewhere I'm not willing to go. And that's why I've made a commitment in my life to myself, to you, to everybody I know. And my commitment is this. I will forgive everybody. How often? All the time. Some of you listen to me. I will forgive everybody all the time. That is my mantra. There is nothing you can say to me, nothing you can do to me that I won't forgive you for. So give it your best shot. I'm going to forgive you. Why? Because I will forgive everybody all the time. I'm going to live that way, because when I look at the scripture, when Jesus said, if you don't forgive others, God's not going to forgive you. That is a price I am not willing to pay for you or anybody else, right? And when Jesus told us to pray, he said, when you pray, you say, forgive us our trespasses as we what? Forgive those who trespass against us. They're always tied together. And so there is a prerequisite to receiving forgiveness from God, and that is our willingness to forgive one another. And so the one message that you probably all know, because you all said it, is that we need to learn to forgive everybody all the time. I'm glad you're getting it. Because, someone once said this, he who fails to forgive burns the bridge that he himself must eventually cross. You understand that, don't you? That when we do not forgive others, then we burn the bridge of forgiveness for ourselves. If you will not forgive your brother, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you. We don't have any choice. It doesn't matter how badly we've been hurt. It doesn't matter how dastardly someone has acted against you. We have no other recourse but to forgive them. That's what the Bible teaches us. I'm going to tell you an amazing story that happened a number of years ago here. We were in Toronto, actually. Myself and the team, we had gone to Toronto. We were doing a meeting there. We had about, maybe 300-400 people out at this meeting. And I was talking about, this was my message that day, to forgive everybody all the time, because that's what I love to talk about. So I was talking about this, talking about forgiveness, talking about the power of forgiveness. And then I went on this little bit of a rant, and I talked about how I didn't care what kind of relationships people had, no matter how broken they were and how low they had sunk. I believe that there is no relationship that is irreconcilable. And that if we would learn how to forgive, and if we would learn how to apologize and take responsibility, we could restore any and every relationship. So that's what I was talking about that day. There was a young man sitting on about the second row on my right over here. And as he was sitting there, he started to think of his own story. And his story was thus. His best friend that he had lived with, they had batched together for a few years. They lived in an apartment together. They did everything together. They went on weekend trips together. They were just as thick as thieves, these two guys, best friends. But they had a falling out. There was an issue. He couldn't even remember what it was they were arguing about anymore. That's often what happens. But anyway, they had such a bad falling out that their relationship ended. They moved out, and they had not spoken to each other for 2 years. So he's listening to me go on about how you need to forgive everybody all the time. And as he's sitting there, he made a decision. And he thought, this is what I'm going to do. When this meeting is over, I'm going to get up, I'm going to walk out those doors, I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to drive all the way across Toronto to the other side, to North York, where my friend lives. I'm going to knock on his door, and I'm going to ask him to forgive me for my attitude towards him. So he had decided he was going to do that. The meeting ended. He stood up, and he turned around, and 5 rows behind him was his friend that he was going to go see in a few minutes' time. Imagine that, 4 million people in Toronto. We're in a room of less than 400 people, and this guy's sitting right behind him. That only happens in the movies, people. And this ain't no movie, right? And so anyway, I meet these two guys, and they're hugging, and they're loving each other, and they're forgiving each other. And I thought, wow, what a great story. You need to understand this. You know what my life is? It's just one huge sermon illustration. That's what it is. I couldn't wait to get home and tell that story. And so I got home, and I stood up in this pulpit, and I started telling that story. So I'm telling the story about these two young guys who learned the concept of forgiving everybody all the time. Meanwhile, there's a guy sitting right over here. He's thinking about his own story, that he had had a falling out with his brother 2 years before. He had not spoken to his brother for 2 years. And so he decided what he was going to do. When the service was over, he was going to get up, he was going to walk up those doors, get in his car, drive across town, knock on his brother's door, and ask his brother to forgive him. The service ended. He stood up, he turned around, and his brother wasn't there. But wouldn't that have made a great ending to this story? But unfortunately, that's not what happened. So anyway, he walks out, gets into the car. As they're driving along, he's telling his wife what he's going to do. He says, this afternoon, I'm driving across town. I'm going to go see my brother. I'm going to knock on his door, and I'm going to ask him to forgive me. She said, that's a good idea. You need to do that, but first we need to stop for some groceries. And they pulled into the grocery store, and they picked up whatever they had picked up, and they were standing in the line at the checkout, and guess who walked in the door of the store, the grocery store? Yeah, you got it right. His brother walked in. His wife turned to him and said, well, what are you waiting for? It doesn't come on more of a silver platter than this, right? Well, what are you waiting for? He said, I don't know. So he headed down, and right there in the dairy section was embracing his brother and loving him and forgiving him, and they reconciled that relationship. That's what this is all about, people. Forgiving everybody all the time. We seek to understand. We seek to forgive. There's no brother, no relationship that is too far gone. It's like the story of these two men. They were sitting in an Irish pub one night, and the one says to the other, so where are you from? He says, I'm from Belfast. He says, so am I. How old are you? He says, 55. 55, so am I. What school did you go to? He said, I went to Shamrock High. Shamrock High, so did I. We must have known each other. So they're going on like this. Just then a third guy walks into the bar. He says, hey, Patty, what's going on tonight? Barkeep says, oh, nothing much. Just the O'Flaherty twins getting drunk again. How do we deal with our disappointments with others? Number one, we seek to understand where they're coming from. Number two is we seek to forgive. And the third and the final thing is this: we seek to move on. We've got to move on with our lives. We can't allow our disappointments to prevent us from moving on in life. You know what happens? What happens is this: we sometimes get to this place where we have been hurt in the past, and so we are afraid of intimacy, and we're afraid of new relationships because we don't want to be hurt again. And we can't go through life immobilized by our past relationships. That's why you have to forgive, and that's why you have to move on. Let me ask you a couple of questions about that. Because Judas betrayed Jesus, we know that. I mean, Jesus knew something about disappointments, didn't he? He had his own people crucify him. He had his best friend, Peter, deny him 3 times. And he had one of his disciples, Judas, who betrayed him into the hands of the Romans. This was the man that had walked with him and lived with him for 3.5 years. And Jesus had poured his whole life and heart into this man, and this man, for 30 pieces of silver, for money, betrayed Jesus. Now here's what I want to ask you. Did Jesus know that Judas was going to betray him? Did he know it was Judas, his betrayer? Yes, he did. Remember, he ID'd him at the Last Supper. He said, this thing you're going to do it quickly. He knew exactly who it was. Now, here's the second part of this question. How long had Jesus known? Maybe for a long time. Maybe he had always known. Because I don't know if you've noticed this, Jesus always kind of knew what was going on, right? He knew who his betrayer was. He knew that Judas was the one stealing. He was the treasurer, and he was stealing from the money bag, and Jesus knew that all along. He knew that Judas was the turncoat in the midst of this. He may have known forever. I don't know if he really wanted to be Jesus' friend, because he always knew what you were thinking, right? It says whenever he encountered the Pharisees, remember what it said? It says, and he perceived what they were thinking, and he said. It's like if you ever get a phone call from a prophet, you know what a prophet will say when he calls you? He says, you're fine, how am I? Right? They always know what's going on. That's why we can't stand prophets. They're too in tune. So I'm getting back to my question about Jesus. He knew Judas was going to betray him. Now, my question is for you is this. If you knew one of your friends was going to betray you, if you knew that without a shadow of a doubt, what would you do? Be honest. You would dump that person like a hot potato. They would be gone so fast from your life that their head would spin. Am I not right about that? Let's just be real clear and honest about this. We would not put up with that for a moment, yet we look at Jesus, and Jesus treated Judas with absolute respect and decorum and love, and he treated him as one of the family, and he never, if you go read the story, never once did he single Judas out and treat him worse than the rest. He treated him like one of his brothers. And he knew that this man was going to betray him, but he loved him and he cared for him just like he did the others, even though he knew that he was going to disappoint him and betray him. Let me personalize this for you for a moment. How many of you in this room, if you're really honest, in the next, let's say, 12 months, you're going to do something to disappoint God? Anybody in the room going to disappoint God? Oh, please. You all get your hands up on this one, right? How many in the next 12 months are going to be disappointing God? Well, I know you're not planning on it, but you're going to. How many maybe in the next month? How many in the next week, if you're really honest? How many by the end of the day? You're right. Let's just be honest about this. We're going to disappoint God. Why? Because we have this sinful nature that we can't seem to shake, and we are going to disappoint God, and you are going to do something that violates God's principles, and most of you will do it by the end of this day. Aren't you glad that God does not judge you based on what you are going to do tonight or tomorrow or next week or next year? He loves you right where you're at now. And you're in church worshiping God. And he's looking down, he says, I like you. You're my favorite. And he knows what a stinker you really are. And he knows that you are going to deny him at some point. And he knows that you might even betray him. And he knows that at some point you're going to do something that's going to in some way insult his character and person. But he doesn't care because he loves you. And he's not only willing to overlook what you've done in the past, he's going to overlook what you're going to do in the future. That's the God in whom we serve. And we need to begin to treat others like that in the same way. So that's why we need to seek to understand, we need to seek to forgive, and we need to seek to move on. Let me give you one quick caveat on this, because sometimes there are people in your life that you have understood and you've forgiven, but when I say seek to move on, sometimes you seek to move on with them, sometimes you have to seek to move on without them, because they're unrepentant, unchanging, their behavior isn't going to change, and you can't walk with them, because they are going to make your life miserable. And you have got to learn to forgive them and let them go and move on without them. But you do need to move on. And when you can get to that place where you can reconcile that relationship, that is obviously the higher pursuit, is to get to that place where you can move on with them. Because that's what the gospel is all about. It's about reconciling man to God and man to man, if we can get to that place. But how do we overcome the disappointments in life? I'll tell you how. We seek to understand, we seek to forgive, we seek to move on. And remember this, he who the Son sets free is free indeed.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope.